Discerning Hearts provides content dedicated to those on the spiritual journey. To continue production of these videos, prayers, and more, go to discerninghearts.com and click the donate link found there or inside the free Discerning Hearts app to make your donation. Thanks, and God bless.
DiscerningHearts.com presents The Final Journey, Insights from a Catholic Deacon and Neurosurgeon with Dr. Stephen Doran. Dr. Doran is a board-certified neurosurgeon with over 25 years of experience and is also an ordained permanent deacon and serves as the bioethicist for the Archdiocese of Omaha. He is the author of To Die Well, a Catholic neurosurgeon's guide to the end of life, the book on which this series is based. His writings in bioethics, neurosurgery, and gene therapy for brain disorders have been widely published in national media outlets, academic journals, and neurosurgery textbooks. He is also the co-founder of Seeking Truth Catholic Bible Study. The Final Journey, Insights from a Catholic Deacon and Neurosurgeon with Dr. Stephen Doran. I'm your host, Kris McGregor. Dr. Doran, thank you once again for joining me.
Well, Kris, it's so delightful to be with you. Thank you so much.
This has been a very impactful series. I'm hearing from so many on Discerning Hearts about how the conversations that we've been having based on your book, To Die Well, a Catholic Neurosurgeon's Guide to the End of Life, has really provoked a lot of not only personal reflection, but a lot of conversation within families. And I've heard from many that it has been a source of healing for them to have revisited other events in their life that helped them to come to a certain type of peace. So on behalf of all those listeners, thank you. We're very grateful for your care for us at this time.
Well, thank you, Kris. I think that I've had a number of people express similar things that, when we go through events in our life, come out of the blue and unexpected, and you just put your head down, get through it, and then you come out the other side and you look back and say, what happened? And I've had a number of people say to me, I just did the best I could at the time, and I didn't really have much to help me. And then kind of going back and reflecting and reading about this, it has brought me some consolation and peace, because I was second guessing myself. Did I do the right thing? Did I do the right thing? And I think that's human nature to do that. And so I think that's been really edifying for me to hear people, as you said, who found some peace and consolation to help them maybe put some of those doubts to rest.
I have to say that this particular conversation we're going to have, based on your chapter 8 of the book, COVID and Dying Alone, I think was one of the most compelling, dare I say provocative, but important chapters that I read. It wasn't just a remembrance of an event, but I really think on many levels it's a call to action to prepare for the future. The shared COVID experience that the world was placed under in the spring of 2020, I can't think of a similar situation, at least for our generation and our children, and that we all shared together. It was such a shocking and immediate experience, and it literally shut down the world, didn't it?
It did, and there might be this temptation to want to put the pandemic behind us and say, okay, we got through that, let's move on. Well, that's just not possible. I mean, the impact of those months and years will be felt for generations. I was just seeing an article about how education suffered and how kids' math scores are just barely bouncing back. And then you see how just things have changed in the work community, where people work remotely, and how medicine has changed. So so many things changed as a result of this. So we just don't want to put it behind us and forget about it. I think it is important to reflect upon that time, because all of us have our own experience through that. And everyone was touched in some way, in many ways. And so I think it's important. That's who we are now. That's part of our reality of our lives right now, is those months and years where so many things happened around us, and so many things happened to us, happened to the church, and So no, it's good. It's good to go to keep that in the foremost of our minds and not just try to put it behind us.
I think it was Cicero that said that those who don't know their history are destined to remain children forever.
But that's true. I mean, we're not slaves to our history, but if we don't learn from it, we're just bound to repeat it. Absolutely.
And in this particular case, it was this event that happened, I don't know about you, but in February of 2020, I know the McGregors, we had all kinds of plans for the year. And we heard distant rumblings of experiences in other parts of the world. I had dear friends in Italy that were beginning to experience the effects of the COVID virus. And it seemed so horrible, but then it still didn't seem real enough to come and affect our country in the United States. But when it did, it happened so quickly, and decisions had to be made so fast because there was this looming danger of an unknown plague, can we call it, that could cause death. And a fear just swept over, I would say, everyone.
You're right, Chris. I reflect back on kind of the immediacy. There was like 1 week in the United States where everything changed overnight. I remember, I think it was a Creighton University basketball game. They called the game off at halftime. They stopped the game. And there was just this urgency, this immediacy to do something. I think that there was probably some wishful thinking, some naivete that we thought, well, through technology, through policies, through whatever, we can stay insulated and we can keep this out of our country, which of course we know that's not the case. The virus spread every part of the world despite all our efforts to the contrary. But it happened so fast. You bring up a really good point that it was like a tsunami that came over us, literally, and we just didn't, we didn't have time to think or react, and then decisions were being made, and I truly believe in my heart that people making decisions at that time had the best intentions. And were all those decisions the best decisions in hindsight? No, I don't think so. But on the other hand, I really truly believe that people were good intended and really, really wanted to save lives. But there was consequences to some of those decisions. And one of which of those is isolation. People became extraordinarily isolated in their homes, isolated in the hospitals, isolated away from the sacraments. We were all put into this literal and figurative box during COVID that we had to stay inside of. And it profoundly changed us. There's no doubt.
It really did. And when you talk about that isolation, we weren't prepared for that, to have a particular type of silence. It either brought families together or it tore them apart. Our relationships were either strengthened or the cracks and the breaks became very apparent.
It exposed weaknesses and it strengthened that which is good. So it did both. It was like there's no middle ground here. You can't be neutral about anything with COVID, it seems like.
I think important for us to go back and revisit it, but not in a way that within maybe 2 years starting to come out of it, there was a dissection that kind of polarized the country, where some said, well, this was very important, this was very good, and others lifted up the points where it was really, really bad, maybe in their particular viewpoint on how we responded. Ended up causing more division, so that the going back and looking at what was the experience so that we can be better prepared for the next time. Because there will be potentially, the way we are communicating globally and traveling globally, that something like this or something of a nature that we can't even comprehend could come upon us just as quickly. And are we prepared? Not just with material means or the response of governments or society, but also spiritually. Are we going to be prepared for that type of potential?
And whether or not something equivalent happens on a global scale in our lifetime, time will tell. But what really is, I don't want to say inevitable, but a very high threat to all of us as individuals is coming again back to this sense of isolation. The risk of being isolated in our lifetime, regardless of what happens on a global sense, that's a real threat. And isolation can lead to despair, and Christ does not want despair. He does not want us to feel isolated because he wants relationship with us. He wants communion with us. And whether that isolation comes from a war, a pandemic, or whether that isolation comes from sin in our own lives, or whether isolation comes because of just circumstances in our life, Christ wants to push through that. He wants to open the door. He wants to free us from that fear of being isolated because he wants us. He desires us. He wants our hearts.
It was, as I said, part of the really compelling part of the book was in the very beginning. It brings out this example of you don't know what lies ahead each day. And so you have this young girl, her name is Samantha, who felt she was so prepared after just leaving nursing school to go out and to do what she was trained for and desired to minister to in her vocation as a nurse. And she went and worked in the ICU, and then she ended up essentially working in, as you described it, it almost seemed like a MASH unit in a war zone, where the effects of COVID in the very beginnings, I think we forget how devastating it truly was, how it was taking lives so quickly that I can't even imagine what it was like. I wasn't a medical professional. I heard stories. You were right there on the front lines. You got to see it with your own eyes and experience it in your own heart.
And I did. And I think what also, prior to medications or vaccines or anything, there was no defenses against it, and it was overwhelming. And people who were vulnerable, elderly, were particularly affected by it. And those caring for them were in fear, right? I mean, in my career, I guess there has been a few times I had some fear in taking care of patients, maybe being exposed to someone who had hepatitis or HIV or something like that. And I was afraid that if I did surgery, I might poke myself. So there's a little bit of fear, but never overwhelming fear. But for caregivers, like nurses in particular, they had to overcome their own fear for their own safety to go care for other people's. I mean, that was truly heroic. Gloves and PPE and all that are great, but people still got sick. Caregivers got sick. Caregivers, they died during this. And so, I mean, you talk about just heroic people, those on the front line, especially nurses who are right there in the thick of it, put their own health risks aside and took care of people during this time. It was truly remarkable.
Wasn't it something to appreciate for the first time? I mean, for me, the courage it took for those who worked in the grocery stores, who worked in those places where we had needs, literally for food, and they were right out there trying to help us. For many of them, they needed to do it because they needed to provide for their own families through work. In those early days, that took a lot of courage.
Yes, that's a very good point. It wasn't just people in the healthcare industry. It was just people who were out there in the public, literally risking their own lives to provide for their families, but also to, I think some people really felt this sense of what I'm doing is important. And in my own small way, I'm doing something that is helping other people. And it's important that I'm doing what I'm doing, whether it's at the grocery store or whether it's someone driving a truck to bring us things on the road. So many people who did things that were so utterly important. And yes, tremendous courage during those times.
Yeah, I think the impact spiritually and emotional, the well-being, it had a profound effect on all that, especially on our mental health for both healthcare professionals and also for patients, those who had to wait. And that it's the importance, I think, that you emphasized on that holistic care to consider in future responses that if things like this occur again, that we're prepared both mentally but also spiritually to help. And that's just every day developing your faith life and then having that be brought into your work environment, how we care for others so we don't take people for granted. I think that's an important thing that we can draw from it, don't you feel?
Yes. I think that for us to be prepared for any disaster, personal or otherwise, requires us to reflect upon, our own lives, our relationship with the Lord, so that should something happen, we have, to the best of our ability, prepared our hearts and our minds, our bodies for whatever it is that comes our way, so that by being in communion with Christ and being in communion with others, we can persevere and maybe even thrive, despite the challenges that might come our way.
If we appreciated people, especially those who were on the front line for us, from the majority of us, if we appreciated it during COVID, we should appreciate them today when the fear is not as prevalent. My hope is that we treat them with the same type of respect and dignity and value what they give to us. And I think that's at the core of Catholic social teaching. This was a prime example of how it should be lived out in our daily lives. In the chapter 2, it underscores that vulnerability of the elderly. What happened during that time, especially for those who were 65 and over, they were the highest percentage of those who suffered during COVID, weren't they?
They were. I mean, all life is equally valuable. And so there's, regrettably, some people were a little bit dismissive about that. I hate to tell you, they're older and, they're going to die soon anyway. I cringe to even tell you that, but I heard people say that. If you're young, you'll be fine. And so people who are dismissive in some way were just expressing this lack of appreciation for what the older generation has given to us, and being kind of dismissive, it's just old people. It was a profound loss to families. And, I remember during COVID, I was put in charge of the state's isolation and quarantine facilities in the state. And so we had people housed in dorms throughout various colleges, and I oversaw that. And what was so profound, and what I confess that I just was not, it wasn't my world, but the world of so many other places where we had multi-generational families living together. That hasn't been my world, but it is the real world, real reality for a lot of people. So grandma, fathers, wives, kids, grandkids, all together. And so then the loss of a generation that occurred, it's tragic in all senses in every family situation, don't get me wrong. But in particular, I think families they still had this traditional integrated multi-generational family, the profound impact that happened when the matriarch or the patriarch died during COVID is a loss that was just so difficult for so many people.
When we talked about learning from history and hopefully being able to reevaluate and put in better strategies, I would hope that in dealing with the elderly that we're able to do that, or just period human beings, because you can go back and you can look at how we treated AIDS patients back at that time when AIDS was rising and we weren't sure what was happening, and how they were placed in isolation and separated out. And part of it is you understand in your head why that needs to occur, because you're dealing with something you don't want to spread. But then when do those strategies begin to eat away at our souls in a way that we can't be present to nurture and to help those people in those final moments, which are crucial for our humanity, not for the one who is just dying, but also for the ones who are the loved ones, the ones that are offering care.
Well, I mean, it was just agonizing for so many families to be separated during this time. And, and then what happened from there too, Kris, is then there was a lack of closure, that funerals were delayed. Not only were they isolated during when a loved one died in the hospital, then, they couldn't have a funeral, or they had a funeral with only 10 people at it. And so it just was adding insult to injury, that even after death, what it did for us, or did to us, that our funeral rites are so critically important for us. And for us to really have that chance to focus on the hope of the resurrection, despite everything that's happened, despite all the terrible things that happened during COVID, it was just made even worse by the fact that we couldn't celebrate that, or we only could celebrate it with a few people. like I said, it was just adding insult to injury, even after people died because of that, the restrictions that were in place.
I would hope that there are conversations taking place, at least in the walls of the church, in the structure of the church, to prepare ourselves. Did we react? Did we respond in the best way that we could? I mean, part of it, I keep going back to the fact that you made the best decision that you can in the moment, because we really didn't have a baseline in this present time to know how to do that. Now, we're going to talk about the 𝗟𝗲𝘀𝘱𝘩 in just a moment. This incredible book that was passed down to us from the 1500s that gives us some clues about what we should have been ready for. Have we learned anything, or at least spent a little time in reflection and for outcomes, so that if something sudden happens again, that we've learned from this and not respond in a manner that it's difficult for me to find the right verbiage for that. Do you know where I'm trying to go with that?
Yeah, I do. So there's a number of individuals who kind of became I guess for lack of a better word, kind of the face of national policy, Dr. Fauci and Dr. Francis Collins. And Francis Collins was the head of the NIH, and I have a ton of respect for him. He's a very devout Christian. I had the honor of working with him when I was a resident in Michigan. He's a good man. But he recently came out and said, our number one priority was to save lives, which is a good thing. But we did so in such a way that everything else became a secondary concern, that the entire emphasis on public health was to save lives. So all the restrictions and everything were enacted because of the good intent to save lives. But it was at the expense of many other things. And in hindsight, he admits that, that might not have been the right approach, that when we make decisions, we do need to look at the entire person, right? We do need to look at not only the biological reality of who they are, their body, and we want to save their biological reality, but we can't ignore the emotional and spiritual components of who we are as human beings. And I think that's what he was saying. We focus so much on the biology of keeping these people alive to the expense of their emotional and spiritual needs. So yeah, I think in hindsight, things could have been done differently. And I was glad to hear him say that. I think he's a humble man. I know some people may feel otherwise because he's part of these decisions, but I think it's important for him and other leaders to go back and reflect, could we have done things better? And his answer is, yeah, we could have. We could have had different priorities.
I want to be very clear for our listeners. I am not criticizing the leadership that we had in individual and dioceses, or even how the church responded worldwide. That's not the point. My hope is that, okay, now that we have lived through this, what have we learned as a church as well? Because there were, I think, some heroic moments at that time. Because you'll remember, Steve, this happened during Lent. It was the lentiest Lent ever in 2020, because we weren't even allowed to go into our churches and to receive the sacraments for the most part. And I just remember there were priests who were located in Omaha, Nebraska during cold periods who would set up in chairs in the parking lot of the church. And people would literally, I never thought in my lifetime I would experience the drive-through confession. But yet there were some creative ways, because those particular priests felt and knew in their hearts they needed to be there and present for their people. Now, that wasn't a diocesan response, and I'm not criticizing dioceses, but my hope is that those in leadership, after reflection, are better prepared for the possibility if this should happen again. And it could. The reality of that in our present world, something like this may occur again. Are we prepared for that?
Well, what's interesting, Chris, is that history does repeat itself, and the isolation or the clergy being unavailable to the faithful is nothing new. And as you mentioned, there's this pamphlet that circulated in the 1300s called the Ars Moriendi, the Art of Dying Well. So during the Black Plague, a third of the population died, including the clergy. But the Black Plague was a century before, and so So the idea for this book, this pamphlet, was that acknowledging the reality that people did not have access to the sacraments and they did not have access to clergy. And how is it then that they could prepare themselves, to die? And that's kind of like what was going on here during COVID. The parallels are striking. We did not have access to the sacraments. We did not have access to our churches. And a lot of our clergy were elderly, and a lot of our clergy got sick, and a lot of them died. So the parallels are striking. And so this booklet, simple booklet, was really important at that time. And I think it's something for us to think about it for ourselves. The chapter in the book talks about this pamphlet, and I encourage people, you can get inexpensive copies online for next to nothing and to read it, because the truths that in there are very simple, but they're very profound. It talks about, temptations that can occur as death approaches, the temptation to despair, for example, the temptation to lose faith, all these things that during periods of stress, which are further compounded by spiritual isolation, the devil likes to work in those areas in particular. And for us to ignore the spiritual realities of good and evil, we do so at our own peril. And so what this booklet was trying to do is try to help people in advance, to be prepared for the, number one, the inevitability of death, but also the possibility when that happens, you might be alone. You might be away from the clergy, from sacraments, or even your family. And so that was the hope for this, is the hope for us to prepare for that possibility of dying alone, but yet still dying well. That's what that title means, the art of dying well, the ars moriendi.
I was so glad that you brought that up, the ars moriendi, because that as you explain, those temptations that are faced by individuals during the pandemics are extraordinary. And it's all related to faith, as you said, despair, but also greed and spiritual pride. Because as you remember, in the very beginning, and I remember this happened after 9/11 in 2001, many of our listeners, some weren't even born at that time, but when that initially happened, all of a sudden, I remember seeing the members of Congress coming out, Republicans and Democrats, united on the steps singing "God Bless America." And there was joint prayer. Well, I remember there was a Thursday evening where everybody went outside in parking lots at shopping centers, or if you were working, and there was a shared prayer. And faith was very strong, and I think that was the way it was for COVID. You immediately go to the heart, and you want to hold on to God, and you want to believe. But as time progressed, and it didn't seem as though this was going to end quickly, the way we're used to, in this present age where things are going to get fixed, and we're going to be back on track before the end of the summer. And things weren't happening that way, that the temptations became very, very loud. And the pamphlet that you speak about, it's what was true in the 1500s was true in the 2000s, because people were stockpiling, there was profiteering, and it exacerbated the global inequalities. The haves and the have-nots. The haves made sure they had more, so in case they ran out, and the ones who had not, they couldn't get.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point. I think that, like many people, I had this thought, well, this will be a problem for, a few weeks, maybe a few months, and then life gets back to normal. And so, because I remember the first wave, we got through the first wave, right? Okay, all's good in the world. Everything's going to be fine. Well, it wasn't. And then the other wave, and then another wave. And so the grind of the pandemic started to really have an impact. The initial reaction is put your big boy pants on, we're going to get through this. Well, you can only do that for so long. You can only be self-sufficient for so long. And that's the case in so many things in our lives, where we think that we can handle this challenge on our own, and by golly, we're going to get through this. Well, in the pandemic, it became clear after a while that that's just not the case, that this is going to go on. And that's when I think these temptations became especially apparent. We started to see, rising rates of depression, anxiety, despair, temptations to greed, profiteering, all these types of things became more and more apparent the longer the plague went on and the longer the pandemic went on. There's so many parallels between these two things. So yeah, hopefully we learn from that collectively as a society, but also individually. Because again, even if there's not some global catastrophe, we could be faced with these same issues on a personal level. And so it's good for us to kind of look back and reflect on those things.
And I think that's what you do so well in this book, because you help emphasize the importance of cultivating those virtues in our hearts of faith, hope, charity, and humility in order to overcome those temptations, and that are often associated with that fear of death. I don't think we connect it to the fear of death very often. There's a reality, if you understand it, then you can take action. You have to be aware that this is going on in your heart. And it helps you not only respond in your own end-of-life journey, but it also helps you respond to your brothers and sisters who are experiencing this.
I mean, what you mentioned is so good. This, as you've done so well in other productions about discernment, with Father Gallagher, the idea that you have to be aware so that you can then take action, right? Those are fundamental parts of discernment. And so sometimes we think about discernment in kind of big life, changes and all those types of things. But discernment is an ongoing process in all the things that happen in our life. And so in a sense, we are called to prepare and discern for our death, right? And to be aware of the movements in our heart regarding death, our fears, or whatever it is, those movements of the Spirit, to identify them and to say, are they taking us away from God? Are they taking us towards God? Identify those movements and then to be aware of them and then to take action on it. So I'm so glad you brought that up, because that process of discernment is not just limited to big life decisions. Well, I guess that's a big life, it's not a decision, but it's a big life event. We're called to be continuously discerning all aspects of our life. And preparation for death is one of those things that we're called to discern, to be aware, to know what's in our hearts, the movements of our hearts, and to identify them.
I think, as you have pointed out to us, that it's important to realize that death is not the end. I think in our mind is, okay, there's a fear of it because this is the death. It's actually the next passage into what we're already experiencing, eternal life, this phase. If we have this in our head, so that our actions, that temptation that if I don't, this is going to be it. Well, it is in that transition to the next phase. And if we are fearful, that's what we have to bring to the Lord to help us. Again, there's a healthy fear that says, you don't want to die, but then also there's the other type of that fear of the Lord, that awe, that, okay, I trust you, and I know you want my greater good, and it's anchored in that hope.
Well, I think what's at the root of what you just brought up in our Western postmodern sensibilities, that we've reduced our humanness to its biological functions. There's this dualism that separates the sacred from the biological, that, our death is not just the cessation of our biological reality. It's the separation of our heart and souls, our bodies from our souls. And if we forget that there's a spiritual reality of who we are as humans, it really brings in a lot of problems. And in this discussion, if we forget the fact that death is not the end, that death, our souls go on, you have every reason to be fearful, because death is the end then, right? When my biological functions end, I'm done. There's nothing else. So if we ignore the reality that we are body and soul and forget the fact that our souls are going to go on, then yes, the despair is going to creep in. Now, when we remember that our souls are eternal and go on, that doesn't make death happy necessarily. It's still a sad event, but it just creates a sense of hope. Like, okay, there's more. There's more. There's the hope for the resurrection. There's the desire to be in union with God. And death it's the way that happens. It's the necessary step for union with God, which then becomes perfected at the second coming. So if we forget that we're a body and soul, then yes, despair is the natural consequence of that.
I think that's why it's so important that every day we're cultivating those virtues, that we're living a life in that hope, in the faith, kindness to others, the practice of caring for one another, that solidarity with other individuals. If we're doing it now in this life, when these moments, that big tsunamis are coming, you're prepared for it because you're anchored in hope. Dying well begins today. It doesn't wait to that last moment of death, but you've been living that life. You've been moving towards this every step of your journey.
Well, St. Robert Bellarmine said it very succinctly. He said, it's pretty simple. If you want to die well, you need to live well. And you're exactly right, Kris, that life begins, that process of living well begins with our baptism, where our souls are infused with the grace of the Holy Spirit that we can call upon throughout our lives, and that becomes nurtured and fed by the other sacraments. And so that grace that's within us allows us better to live a virtuous life, to live by those theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, and to cultivate the other virtues, the gifts of the Holy Spirit that Paul talks about, kindness, gentleness, and so on and so forth, so that we are living well. And by that, we will die well. Now, as we've talked about before, dying well doesn't mean an easy death, doesn't mean a painless death or something like that necessary, but it's a life that's lived in anticipation of heaven, a life that's lived in anticipation of the resurrection. That's the mark of, I guess, of a good life leading to a good death.
You in the chapter, I think what was more eye-opening to me, we alluded to it in the beginning of our conversation, but that perception, at least on my part, of healthcare professionals, that you move from being appreciated, and you're so grateful they're there, to becoming targets of anger and frustration. How can Catholic healthcare ethics ultimately guide those practitioners, especially those who are practicing Catholics and Christians, through these moral distresses? And they can support not only the community, but they can help themselves in upholding that commitment to that compassionate care you discuss in the chapter.
I think if there's lessons to be learned, Kris, that's one of them. I think you raised a good point. I think that, as a consequence of that stress, that caring for patients and being the focus of anger, there's a lot of people who left. I mean, the nursing crisis in particular, as COVID went on, became very severe. And there's a lot of people who left nursing, at least in the hospital setting, who just won't go back. And young woman I talk about here, Samantha, she left critical care nursing. She's working in obstetrics ward, which is wonderful. It's great. And she's a beautiful woman who's doing great work there too. But there wasn't support. Everybody's just kind of like fighting for themselves and barely getting through the day and going home and falling into bed and afraid they're going to bring sickness home to their family and pretending to be able to come up with some sort of specific way of doing this. But the lack of support we had for so many people just further fed that isolation, and there's consequences. There's a shortage of healthcare providers. The hospitals are still very, very full right now because there's not enough healthcare workers, and there's sick people, and we're still feeling the impact of COVID when it comes to just people who are able and willing to care for other people. And gosh, I wish if we had a do-over, I wish we would have done that better. I wish we would have done that better to care for the people caring for people.
I spoke of March of 2020 being the lentiest Lent ever. And I think maybe for future Lents, maybe that might be a spiritual practice, is to go back and look at ourselves. How did we react? How did we treat others? Where was the disposition of our hearts? And what can the Lord, in the light of our prayer, enlighten for us and how we might be able to grow and be able to be more Christ-like out in the world? Again, not only to appreciate the healthcare worker, but do we continue to be grateful for those who supply for our needs, whether it be wherever it might be, those who in the grocery stores, or those who take care of our garbage, or those that we took for granted, the waitress, the waiter at the restaurant. In fact, the restaurants opened again. Are we still grateful?
That's such a good point, Kris. I think that it's so easy, to kind of forget those lessons of COVID, and yet how they're so important to. We would hope our hearts would have changed in some ways, in some permanent way, like that sense of gratefulness that we initially had. That, well, now it's kind of life goes back to normal, and we forget about those who do things in service for us. All those jobs that you mentioned are in service for us. And I think that would be a good practice for me. And I think for other people too, is to take Lent and to, be very mindful about and grateful for those who serve us in some way. There's so many people who do. The people who serve us in the church, in our jobs, out in the community. To be grateful for those who give for us. Because what is the antidote to selfishness? It's gratitude. the vices have an opposite virtue. So to focus on gratitude and thankfulness to overcome that inclination to maybe take people for granted for their willingness to care for me in a real way. So I think that's a great idea.
And I would also say for many of us, and I have to continually go back and revisit this in my own heart, as Catholics, the value that we have for our churches, and the opportunity to receive the sacraments, that we're not just attending a social gathering of friends and hearing a homily, but that we're actually having an encounter with grace. I think that's one of the things that was so difficult, the starving for that, and that anointing of the sick. The anointing of the sick that I know a young priest, I watched him cry because he was denied access to a nursing home. He tried to get to his people in his parish, and he was sobbing because he could not bring the anointing of the sick to those who were asking for it. And yet, do we take those, our sacraments, those encounters of divine grace, do we take those for granted? We really have to take a look, not only as individuals, but as families. What are we passing on to our children?
I'm mindful when you're telling this story that I think people who are in a ministry in whatever way, are priests, religious ministers at a church. If you think about it, the reaction to a fire for most people is to run out of the fire, but the other people show up, the first responders, they run into the fire. They run into the fire. And that's what our clergy, our priests wanted to do. They want to be like that fireman running into the fire to save, to bring hope, to bring sacraments, and the frustration that that's what they were there for, to run into the fire, and they couldn't. And how hard, how difficult it was to be unable to do what your heart wanted so much to do, is to run into that fire of suffering while everybody else is running out.
I think that's the kind of a part of that element of compassionate care that I hope that the church has a time of reflection, can find ways of being that. I mean, we celebrate saints. During our whole conversation, Saint Damien of Molokai, coming back into my mind, I'm thinking of all of the missionaries of charity throughout the world and all the other religious orders that are serving right now in hotspots that are experiencing severe illnesses. We, in the United States, where we're recording this, I think we feel that we're safer now. And so life, for most of us, we feel it's gone back to normal. But there are communities with large populations that are suffering not only the effects of a pandemic, but we're not even aware of because they're so poor they don't make it to the news. They're not sending news crews out to these places, but also in war-torn areas. This still is prevalent, but we're just not aware of it, I think, because it's not on our screens.
Right, right. I think you're right, Kris. I agree.
Every chapter in the book is so important, I think, but this one, it jumps out because I think this is a communal type of sharing that I hope that it's a discussion that if there is still some heat around it, because it's maybe for some still fresh, as far as whether they agreed or disagreed after reflection about how we might have responded, that we can get past that and try to find what the fruits of this experience. I mean, ultimately, the Father allowed it. The Father in heaven allowed it. So good. He wants our greater good. So what is the lesson that we can take as Christians? Where did we do well and where did we fail?
Well, we know that God works for the good in all things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you're exactly right that He allowed this, and that it is a chance for us now to go back and reflect on a personal level and on a societal level. What is it that we can do better without necessarily beating ourselves up or beating other leaders up and say, okay, what did we learn from this? How can we respond better now as individuals, like you were saying earlier, to be grateful, just to remember that gratefulness that we had during the pandemic and just kind of stir up that sense of gratefulness just in normal day-to-day life, but then also the kind of the bigger picture of what if something like this happens again? How can we prepare ourselves, our own hearts, and how as a society prepare for the entire person, not just their biological reality, but how can we prepare for their emotional and spiritual needs too?
I just would say that I know for me, there are opportunities that during the experience, I put the virtues away. There were several of them that I just parked over on the side and I responded to the temptation. And my hope is that, okay, I realized that I failed on my own through my fault, most grievous fault, right?
Right.
My hope is that the ones that I set aside, if I can bring them and desire them and want to practice them today, that I won't be so quick to set them aside in the future. And I hope that others feel that way. And I think your book really helped me to want to cultivate that in my life. So I'm so grateful for that.
Well, thank you, Kris. That's beautiful. I think to stir up those virtues and to recall the ones that maybe we kind of parked on the shelf for a little bit, that's a really, really good reflection.
Any final thoughts, Steve?
Well, I guess what I would say is that keep coming back to this idea that we can't forget who we are as body and soul, and that if we forget that, it leads to all sorts of bad things, and decisions where we start treating the biological realities and ignore the spiritual realities, and we have to remember that. And so in this issue of dying alone, moving forward, remembering that we have souls, and that for us to forget that, we need to remember that despite the sadness of death, there is more, and our souls live on, and that our lives are meant to prepare for that reality, that through death, that's how we meet Jesus, and to prepare ourselves for that event. And so, just to be mindful that we have a soul and to care for our souls.
Again, we're so grateful for you, Dr. Doran. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kris.
You've been listening to The Final Journey, Insights from a Catholic Deacon and Neurosurgeon with Dr. Stephen Doran. To hear and or to download this episode, along with many others, visit _discerninghearts.com, or you can find it within the free Discerning Hearts app or wherever you download your favorite podcasts. This has been a production of Discerning Hearts. I'm your host, Kris McGregor. We hope that if this has been helpful for you, that you will first pray for our mission, which is to offer authentic and rock-solid spiritual formation freely to souls around the world. And if you feel it's worthy, please consider a charitable donation, which is fully tax-deductible, to help support our efforts. But most of all, we hope that you will tell a friend about discerninghearts.com and join us next time for The Final Journey, Insights from a Catholic Deacon and Neurosurgeon with Dr. Stephen Doran.